Today, I'm going to be speaking with Matthew Stewart, who's a philosopher and author of several books, including most recently The 9.9%, The New Aristocracy That Is Entrenching Inequality and Warping Our Culture. Really appreciate having you on, Matthew. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
So we often hear about the 1%. We hear about the 0.1%. We hear about the bottom 90% many times, or the bottom 50% in discussions of economics and society and culture. What is significant about this 9.9% that made you want to study and write about it specifically?
So let's not forget that the 0.1% is actually driving the wealth inequality, and the bottom 90% is the group that's losing. So there's two interesting things about the 9.9%. One is that it's actually holding on to its wealth. So that's, I think, really important. And then the other thing is that it plays a much bigger role in driving our values and our culture. So that's, I think, what makes them especially interesting, because I think we're all part of it, even if we're not financially part of it.
Can you talk about the ways in which that group drives culture?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, in education, it's pretty straightforward. The plan for making it into the 9.9% today is to go to college and go to a good college and get a good degree and so on. And that kind of plan made a lot of sense when college was inexpensive, when a lot of it was publicly paid for, and when there were jobs for people who got those kind of degrees. But all those realities are gone, and yet the value system is, if anything, even more entrenched. So there's even more emphasis on you can make it if you just go to the right college and you sort of figure out how the system works. And then it turns out, of course, that the people who succeed in that are the ones who already start with a leg up, whose parents are already in the 9.9%.
What are the economic what's the line for entering that group, that 9.9%, in terms of where is the 90th percentile in terms of income and wealth, and how far up does it reach?
Yeah. So, but let me also just qualify and say that we don't want to get too fetishized about the numbers, because they move, and also it's not just about the numbers; it's sort of
Sure.
about relative proportions. But basically, you need about $1.2 million in net worth to make it into the top 10 decile, or the 9.9% of the wealth distribution, and your income should be in the 120,000 plus range. So that's what kind of gets you into it financially. And then at the top end, obviously it's different as you get to the top, but about 20 million will push you out the top in wealth, and sort of 500,000 or so in income, which sounds like a lot, but in fact, when you compare it to the very large sums that are going into the 0.1%, it's actually pretty small. So the group is more homogenous than people like to think.
Now, what's interesting is, certainly, I would guess the vast majority of the bottom half of that group would consider themselves middle class, and many who live in the most expensive cities would absolutely insist that they are middle class. Is that culturally relevant, that so much of that group considers itself middle class? And is it accurate in some sense?
Yeah. So what's happening is the hollowing out of the middle class, but the ideas are about 20 or 30 years behind the economic reality. So a lot of people in this 9.9%, even in the bottom part, they don't get how wealthy they are relative to the rest of society. They don't quite get how much better they do have it. And of course, part of the reason why they don't get it is because they're also being stressed. I mean, it's pretty hard to stay in that group. You have to work really hard, and get some lucky breaks and be in the right place at the right time and so on. So I think there's a significant misperception in the group of just how wealthy they are, and a lot of this shows up in surveys. You ask people, how much do the people at the top make? And they say, oh, well, the average CEO makes $1 million a year. And of course, that's preposterous. And the average CEO makes 17 or $18 million a year for a top 500 company. So I think there's a lot of misperceptions. And the one you mentioned, the middle class illusion, is a really big one.
Can you talk a little bit about the racial makeup of this group that you're describing, generally speaking?
Yeah, pretty simply, it's mostly white. It's about 90% white. as against, depends how you measure it, 65 to 70% of the general population. There definitely are people of color in the 9.9%, a significant group, but in relative to the representation in the total population, it's significantly lower. So I think the Black share is about 1.7% of the 9.9%, as against about 13% of the general population. Latino is roughly similar.
In terms of political power, I mean, we understand the dynamics of money and political power in the United States, generally speaking, but that top 9.9% is much bigger in terms of population by definition than the top 0.1%. In terms of aggregate power, and that doesn't mean it's being wielded effectively, but in terms of aggregate power, what is the power dynamic between that top 0.1% and the following 9.9?
Yeah, it's the 9.9% presents this big political problem, especially for the Democratic Party, frankly, because that group now is leaning blue. It's not completely blue, but it's more so than the general population. Whereas the top 0.1%, notwithstanding all the nonsense about limousine liberals, actually functionally leans very much to the right. And the dynamic between them, it's a really great question. It's, on the one hand, the 9.9% is fundamentally dependent on the 0.1% economically, but on the other hand, culturally, there is a big gap, and a significant part shifting left is aware of that and tries to pull away. The big danger for the Democratic Party and the left is that this group, which I think has a disproportionate weight in left politics, doesn't necessarily understand or share the interests of the other 90% of the population. So they tend to skew the left in ways that can be ultimately go against the interests of the large part of the population and sort of work indirectly for the top.
Oh, that's interesting. So let's see if we can think about that a little. So the top 0.1% leans overtly to the Republican side, and it's sort of clear that the economic interests of that group in terms of the policy they want is not good for the bottom 90%. It sounds like you're saying with the following 9.9%, nominally, these are folks who identify more as Democrats than Republicans and believe themselves to lean more left than they lean right. But maybe without even really knowing it, the policies they want or the status quo that they reinforce is also not good for that bottom 90%.
Yeah, I mean, a classic example for me is the real estate game. So we don't actually pay a lot of attention to this issue in national politics, but it actually drives a lot of our culture, and it drives a lot of the issues that we have. The huge segregation, economic and racial, in our neighborhoods. And the role of the 9.9% in that, I would say on aggregate, is really pretty regressive, because what it ends up doing is saying, oh, the issue isn't, our neighborhoods. The issue has to do with, any number of other things, personal prejudices, with education, with, economic policies that interest us more. But in fact, the 9.9% tends to ultimately come down very heavily in favor of very restrictive zoning and other very restrictive land use policies that drive up the price of housing, that have created an affordability housing crisis, that reinforce segregation dynamics, that reinforce educational segregation dynamics. And so they end up being, very regressive. And it's something that the 9.9%, I think intellectually, the more self-aware members are onto this, but functionally, the way they actually act ends up, reproducing these divisions that in turn increase inequality and work to the benefit of the 0.1%.
One of the things that often comes up in conversation with people who do well, but are not in the top 0.1%, and maybe not even in the top 1%. So maybe we're talking about 90th to 98th percentile to kind of imagine. Again, as we're talking about, these are not exact delineations, but there's often the feeling among the 90 to 98% that, hey, the very top doesn't pay enough in taxes, and we do need to do things for the bottom 90%, but also the taxes are a little too high on us, the 90 to the 98. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and really where some of these lines should be in terms of taxation.
Yeah, so there's a grain of truth in that. It turns out that the real tax rate, when you throw it all in, the federal, state, and local, you look at capital and income and so on, the real tax rate at the very top is lower. It's dramatically and absurdly lower than it is for the upper middle class and so on. So vis-a-vis the 0.1%, the 9.9% is getting screwed like the rest of society. There's another side of it, though, that's a little harder for people in the 9.9% to grasp, and that's that our tax system is so arcane and complicated that it ends up indirectly subsidizing a lot of people invisibly. So, a classic case in point is the mortgage interest deduction. But there are many other bits and pieces like that have the effect of subsidizing the 9.9% in ways that are kind of invisible. So people in that group think that their taxes are actually higher than they are. Going back to real estate, that's another kind of invisible subsidy. We have, notwithstanding the fact that we do have municipal property taxes, we basically don't capture the implicit rental value of real estate. And so people who own their own homes end up getting an indirect tax subsidy, but they're completely unaware of this. They think they're geniuses for having bought into the real estate market when they did. And so they're kind of unaware that some of the money that's coming their way is really an indirect tax subsidy. So it's a really complicated picture. And of course, I'm sure you'd agree, if we could wave a magic wand, we'd replace the current tax system, have something radically more progressive and a lot more fair.
Yeah, I've had very interesting conversations with folks who say, I don't really make that much, and I'm touching the 33% federal tax bracket. And then if I live in New York or California or Massachusetts, then you're throwing 5 to 10% on top of that. And I'll often say to these folks, listen, you don't have to tell me exactly what you make, but understand that you're touching that top 33%, but not all of your income is taxed at that, because we have, these are brackets, marginal tax brackets, and then you've got your standard deduction. And you have a mortgage, and you've got, all these different things. You should really look at that first page of your 1040, which says total tax, divide it by your income, and you are going to find a shockingly low number. And many times it's 17, 18% federally overall. And these are folks absolutely in that 9.9% who themselves don't really have an understanding of the degree to which they are paying federal taxes.
Yeah, but let's just not forget that. I mean, the big money is at the very top.
Of course,
and the big solution here
absolutely
is actually to go after the
Another 2 or 3 points for someone making $180,000 a year has almost no impact compared to what we're talking about in the 0.1%, without a doubt.
Right. But then let me also mention on the other end, because this is something that happens when we talk about the 9.9%. We forget about people that are at the other end of the economic spectrum. We don't think about sales tax as a big issue generally, if you're a member of the 9.9%, but that's actually a pretty significant hit to a lot of people with lower incomes. We don't think about the FICA, the payroll tax deduction, but that if you've got a minimum wage job, that's a big chunk of your income. So things are much more regressive than people understand in the 9.9%.
Without question. The book is fascinating. It's called The 9.9%, the new aristocracy that is entrenching inequality and warping our culture. We've been speaking with the book's author, Matthew Stewart. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, great to be here, David. Thank you.